Hello, listeners. Welcome to Misfit Apparitions, the podcast. Thank you for joining us. I'm Don, and I apologize for the sound of my voice. I've been suffering from a cold, and this is about the best I'm going to sound before releasing this episode tonight. Thank you for your understanding. In this episode, we'll continue our series on the Villisca Ax Murder House with part 2 of our 3-part phone interview with the person most knowledgeable about the Villisca Ax Murder Case, Dr. Edgar Epperly, author of the book Fiend Incarnate, Villisca Ax Murders of 1912. Please be warned, this episode contains mature subject matter. Listener discretion is advised. Did you in your research find any evidence of premeditation?
Yeah. I don't bring any forensic background to this study. I'm not a student of criminology or anything of that nature. Actually, people are forever saying, well, you ought to do this murder, you ought to research this murder, or you ought to read this book. I have read some books about murder, but specialized ones. I've read a lot about Jack the Ripper. I've read quite a bit about Lizzie Borden, but it was more from a literary view because I was confronted with the same problem that you didn't have a solution to your murder, really, at least that everyone agreed on. And so you have a climax at the beginning of the book and then no way to resolve it. And I was curious at how other people had done that kind of thing. But the way I would answer the idea of whether it was premeditated or not was yes and no. I think it was spontaneous in the sense that the killer did not come looking for those victims. And some of the reason you believe that, one, he didn't bring a weapon with him. He didn't have any way of killing them until he found a weapon in the backyard, their own axe that was leaning by a coal pile. And that suggests that it kind of bubbled up an instant. If Kelly, the minister who was in town that night, if he was the murderer, then I think it was entirely spontaneous. I think Kelly had a long history of voyeurism, window peeking. He spent a lot of his life trying to persuade or young women to pose for him. And he also got caught more than once looking in windows where people were going to bed, that kind of thing. And if Kelly did it, it was a case of him looking for someone to peek on and seeing the Stillinger girls going to bed. And then probably they went to bed before he saw everything he wanted. And he was frustrated, and the axe presented himself. And he, on the spur of the moment, if everybody in that house is dead, I can look all I want.
Right.
And that, of course, explains a great deal in many ways. It explains why the killer sealed the house so carefully. Every shade was drawn to the windowsill. The killer had taken clothing, black skirt, out of the dresser and pinned it up over the glass in the front doors. The killer had arranged, he had a lamp with the chimney removed sitting at the foot of the Stillinger's bed. The older Stillinger girl had been pulled maybe a third of the way down the bed, and it rotated at the hip so that her buttocks was exposed, and genitals were exposed, and he had covered the mirror in that room, again taking a piece of clothing out of one of the dressers and draping it over the mirror. A piece of bacon had been located, a 3-4 pound piece of bacon, and was in the murder room with the Stillinger girls and leaning up against the wall with the axe, which was left there. The axe had been cleaned to some degree. He had wiped it with an undergarment and threw the garment under the bed. There's still blood and hair on the axe, but it had been cursorily cleaned. Anyway, he spent quite a bit of time in the house, and that would suggest that that's why Kelly was tried for the murder of Lena Stillinger. He wasn't tried for all of the murders. The focus was on Lena because she was the one that was posed, and she was the one that the killer could have looked at if that's what he was posing her for. Now, some people have talked that the killer might have been in town and cased the joint, had looked at the house and realized that there were people in there, or young children, things like that. In fact, some people made a great deal out of the fact that there was a barn behind the house on their lot. They had a couple of farm animals. They had a cow and a horse, chickens. And if you go to the south side of that barn on the second floor, up in the mow, the hay mow, there is a knothole. Now, the barn's gone now, but there was a knothole that you could look through and see the house. The house was framed in that knothole. And there was also a depression in the hay where it looked like someone had been lying down looking through that knothole. And some people made a great deal out of that this suggests that the killer had crept into town and then hid himself in the barn and observed the house and laid his plans and then went in and killed them. So that, in that sense, that would be premeditated. But I have never been overly impressed by that logic. You've got three boys, 5-year-old, 7-year-old, 12-year-old. And the chances that somebody is laying up there in that barn and looking through that knothole is probably pretty good. But it's probably pretty high that it's one of the boys or all of the boys. And it was a way to kind of spy on the house and the mother and their sister and that kind of thing. I think it's a leap to suggest, for one thing, the killer came in several days early or a day or two early. It increases greatly the chance that someone would have seen them. It's about 8 blocks from the railroad. If it was a serial traveling killer, it almost certainly came in on the railroad. That means somehow he's got to cover 8 blocks, find the house. Why that house was attractive, I don't know. But and then spend a fair amount of time taking quite a chance, really, because you got three young boys running around. The chance that one of them would scoot up into the haymow gets pretty strong if it's 2 or 3 days that he's up there. Mm-hmm. So I don't have much of a support for that particular idea. I would rather suggest, if it was a serial killer, that he was looking for some kind of a sign. Maybe it was the fact that there was a weapon in the backyard, and that kind of God directed him, or Satan directed him, or something. The other possibility, it could be as simple as they didn't have a dog. Mm-hmm. You know, he walked by a house and that dog isn't aroused. That's a house that I might be able to strike and not have anybody awakened. Mm-hmm. It would be things like that. So it could be premeditated, but it might not have been either. It might have been just spur of the moment. Now's the chance, and do it.
And what was the opinion of investigators about Lena Stillinger's being the only female victim found staged in that pose?
What would be the opinion? What?
Of the investigators of why she was in that pose. She wasn't sexually assaulted, but she was in a pose that suggested she may have been.
Yeah, yeah. The investigators, they, particularly the state, Havner, who was the state attorney general 5 years later and prosecuted Kelly, they were convinced that the way she was posed revealed sexual nature of the murder, that the killer was driven to look at the victim, the sexual parts. And that's why they thought Kelly was a prime suspect. That's why they followed up on Kelly and finally built a case against him, because of his long history of trying to persuade after the murder in late 1913, a year and a half after the murder, he was preaching in Winter, South Dakota, and he put an ad in the Omaha World Herald in which he was asking for a stenographer. He was writing a book, and he wanted a stenographer to help him. And he got a young woman, 28-year-old woman, answered the ad. And he wrote back to her saying, "You sound fine. I would like to hire you. There is one requirement, though, and that is you have to type in the nude." And she was shocked by that and took it to her pastor, and they took it to the police, who took it in turn to the postal authorities. And the postal authorities and the police wrote a bogus letter, dummy letter, back to him, basically saying, "Well, this sounds interesting. Tell me more." And his answers got progressively more salacious until finally, I think they exchanged 7 letters. And Kelly then was arrested and charged with sending obscene material through the mail and convicted. And they would have sent him to Leavenworth federal crime, but they didn't, because he was so mentally ill by this time, under the pressure he broke and was completely psychotic. And they sent him to the National Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C., St. Elizabeth Hospital, where he was treated for something like 9 months and then released. Well, the state, because of these things, they thought that Kelly was behind it, and he had posed her so he could look at her. And there was no sexual touching that they could determine. The hymen was intact. There were no fluids, no evidence of any kind of sexual assault. Mm-hmm. But they assumed that he masturbated while he looked at the girl, who happened to be dead by now, of course. Mm-hmm. It seems to me there are 2 really crucial questions about the scene. One is, why did the killer leave Lena Stillinger in this position? What does that say about motivation and things like that? The other one is all of the victims were struck in the head. In most cases, it looks like a single blow. There's some argument. Some thought there were more than one, but these kids were young, and this axe is a big, burly axe, and if the killer swung it with any intent, it would completely shatter those children's skulls. And so it's a little hard to tell. But the 2 adults, the husband and wife, the killer just erased them. They were struck repeatedly. Joe, there was no face left, nothing except the back of the skull. Everything else had been obliterated. In fact, one of the doctors speculated that the killer had turned the axe on the flat side, and just like a maul, with the blade laying flat, to just crush the head completely. And Mrs. had been struck on top of the head, a killing blow. And then she had been struck across the face with the blade of the axe, so that the doctor said that her face had been reduced to approximately 1-inch slices, going up from the chin to the forehead. And the question is, why did he do this? I mean, why would this intense rage or anger or fear or what that he directed to the only two adults at the scene? Now, admitted, they were the only two that threatened him, and so I could see him killing them, but there's pretty good evidence, at least I find it's pretty good evidence. I think there's pretty good evidence that the killer was in the adult's bedroom twice when he killed them, and then when he came back, and probably that's when he mutilated them so completely. And that's based on a couple of pieces of analysis that was done. One, Mrs. Moore, Sarah, she put her shoes under the bed on Joe's side of the bed, which would be the south side of the bed. Their bed ran east and west upstairs. And Joe, when he was hit, blood ran across the pillow and out of the bed onto the floor, and it nearly filled one of her shoes. But when the people came in the morning, that shoe was tipped over, and there was blood had dripped on the side of the shoe and the sole of the shoe. And of course, when they got there at that time, the blood was all coagulated or wasn't flowing anymore. So that suggests to me that the killer struck Joe, and then later it had to have time to fill, the blood had to have time to fill the shoe. Later, the killer came back and turned the shoe over, probably inadvertently, and blood was still flowing and flowed on the bottom of the shoe. The second thing is, a lot of people those people who were running through the house didn't really realize that Mrs. had been struck with the blade like she had, partly because you had the cuts, but then the face was vaguely recognizable because the cuts were together, but you could just open it up like an accordion if you pulled on it, the chin or anything. And in the process, there was no blood in those cuts in her face, which suggests that she was already dead when those were made, that the blood had already pooled and flowed away was no longer flowing. There was no heart action. And that suggests to me that sometime during the event, he felt the need or the desire to come back and literally erase the two adults. Now, I don't know enough criminal psychology to answer a question like that, but it does seem to me that those two things, the way that Lena was left and the sexual implications of that, and then the violence to the adults, are the two most interesting and probably significant elements of the scene.
Absolutely. So the theories on who committed these murders, are there any that are 100% not plausible?
Yeah, there is one. The Jones case, first thing, the local people who believed it started to believe it before they had any basis for it. I mean, they believed it because well, it's like if you and I, if we get into an argument or a fight with our neighbor, and anybody knows that, and then something happens to the neighbor, there'll be people who say, well, I think he might be involved because I know he was shouting over the back fence. But those people in town were making those accusations just based on this general, uh, not anger, just general belief that F.F. Jones had animosity towards the murdered man, and I think he probably did. But it seems completely out of proportion that he would arrange to kill the entire family, and in this case, two guests that were visiting. It doesn't seem reasonable. But the detective, the Burns detective agent Wilkerson, came to town 2 years after the murder. He had been hired by the state of Iowa, and had also gotten money from the Burns agency from the local citizens who had raised funds to continue the investigation. And he was an unsavory character. He was at that time in his life, he had a very long and varied life, but at that time in his life, he was perfectly willing to convict an innocent man of murder if it would provide him with publicity and money. And he quickly assessed the situation and figured out that the real feeling now, 2 years after the murder, is that Jones is somehow behind it. He spent 2 years, 14 to 16, investigating the murder, not full time, but he was in and out of town doing it. And he would talk to people and there were, as the county sheriff said, we had 1,000 rumors, and everybody who heard one added something to it and passed it on. And it was just a boiling pot of, do you think it could be? Some of them were outlandish. A lot of them, there were speculation that the father of the visiting girl, Joe Stillinger, he had done it. No basis at all for that. And there were things like that. And then there were rumors that the Salvation Army was involved in some way. Somebody came up with that. Someone else had a rumor that there had been a guy from Villisca who had gone to Oklahoma and had married a Oklahoma Indian, and there had been a murder in that family, and so they had sent an assassin, an Indian assassin, to come up and kill, and that's why it was like a tomahawk. It just baseless ideas. What Wilkerson did was he canonized the rumors. He took all of this ferment of ideas, and he decided, no, we'll ignore that, and this is important, and this is important, and he built a case. He devised a way who the killer was. He devised the system. How did they get into the town? How did they get out of the town? All of that. For him to do that, he convinced the bulk, more than half of the local citizens, that F.F. Jones had hired a man called William Mansfield, who was a butcher, worked in meatpacking industry. He actually was a labor organizer, and he went from meatpacking plant to meatpacking plant, organizing until somebody, management, caught him, and then they would fire him, and he would hop on the train and go to another plant and start over. And so Mansfield's wife, daughter, father-in-law, mother-in-law were all killed by a axe murder in Blue Island, Illinois, south of Chicago, suburb of Chicago. And that was in 1914, 2 years after the murder. And so Wilkerson immediately insisted that the two murders were just alike and that Mansfield was the killer. And he built his whole case around Mansfield. They arrested Mansfield in 16 and brought him back to face a grand jury. Grand jury met for about a week, 4 days, I think. And they let him go. No true bill. He wasn't guilty. Grand jury secret, of course, so the local citizens didn't know what had happened. They thought that they had caught the killer. Wilkerson assured them that he was the killer, and he had been hired by F.F. Jones, and now F.F. Jones had used his money and his political power to pack the grand jury and to get off and escape. And the problem is that Mansfield had documentary evidence and testimonial evidence that he was working in Montgomery, Illinois. He worked for a provisioning company. It was a food service that provided food for railroad workers when they were repairing a stretch of road somewhere. And they had a pay slips where they had signed and countersigned, and he had been working for that company from the 8th of June to the 19th of June and got paid for it. And he had the owner of that company and the paymaster and the foreman all testified that they knew Mansfield and he was working at that time. And so Wilkerson's case really evaporated in the sense that he couldn't prove it. Later, they did have a grand jury. There was a slander suit came in where Jones sued Wilkerson for slander. That became a trial of Jones for murder, really. And the upshot of that was that the jury ruled in favor of the detective Wilkerson. And so the majority of people thought that he was going to be arrested and tried along with Mansfield. And the grand jury met, and Wilkerson's case fell apart. I mean, the people came in and they did not testify the way that Wilkerson said they were going to testify. What happened was that Wilkerson would interview these people, and then he would shade their responses as far as he could towards involving Jones. And then when they were asked directly, no, I didn't say that. I said this. And his case evaporated. And so I'm quite confident that F.F. Jones might have been an arrogant son of a bitch, but he was not behind the murder in any way. I think the majority of people still believe that, local people, I think they feel that he was somehow behind the murder. But I think that's just, in their desperation to solve it, that's what happened.
Yeah, it does seem that Wilkerson took advantage of a lot of people back at that time.
Yeah.
It all leads to Reverend Kelly with his confession, him being left-handed, and his history of perversion being the person that was brought to trial.
Yeah. Kelly was such an unlikely prospect that the public could not accept him as a killer. He's a tiny guy. He was 5'2" and weighed 119 pounds when they arrested him. And people just couldn't vision him going into the house and carrying this axe and being willing to kill all of these people, not being afraid of Joe Moore's a big guy. He's 6 foot and 200 pounds probably. Of course, Kelly wouldn't have known that, but still, it would. I would think if Joe was awake and Kelly was in the room with the axe and Joe didn't have a weapon, I think Joe would be the one that came out of the room myself, but that's just speculation. And the other thing was he's a minister, and it was very hard for. He was a good minister. People liked his sermons. He was an intelligent man. People found it hard to believe that he could have done anything like a murder. And nobody knew about it at the time. The police started to suspect him within a month probably a week, of the murder because he was obsessed by it. He wrote letters to county attorney, to county sheriff, to Marshal Horton, the state attorney general, the Burns Detective Agency, the O'Leary Detective Agency, on and on and on. Big, long, rambling letters in which he talked about taking a walk that night and hearing the thud of the axe, and the killer was disturbed and came out on the porch rather than because a couple passed by the house. Strange things as to how would he know these things. So they started a quiet investigation, and in the fall, a few months after the murder, they ran across the fact that he had sent a bloody shirt to the laundry in Counts Bluffs the week of the murder. Perhaps more damning than that was that he had sent it in an unusual manner. He's living in a little town called Macedonia, and they had a laundry drop so that they didn't have a laundry in that little town, but you could take your white shirt from Sunday and put it in a basket down at the pharmacy, and the pharmacist sent it to this laundry, and they billed it and came back, and you paid the bill, and the pharmacy took a cut, and the laundry took a cut, and you got a clean shirt. Well, the week of the murder, the week of the murder, there was a package came back that hadn't been sent. It had been taken to the laundry and pushed through the drop slot, and they found it was a bloody shirt, and they had cleaned it, but blood is difficult to clean, apparently, and they didn't have it completely cleaned. There was still some stain. And all it said was, will be claimed. It didn't say who had sent it or anything like that. And so the pharmacist got curious, and he opened the package and found the shirt and wrapped it up again, and then waited, and Kelly was the one who picked it up. And that got to the authorities. Actually, the pharmacist, I think, talked to a local lawyer who in turn contacted the state attorney general, and they followed up on it. And they did later they did some interviewing of the people who received the shirt and the people who cleaned the shirt. So that suspicion was there. And then in 1914, when he got in trouble in Winter, South Dakota for sending obscene material through the mail, that made him a good deal more interesting to the authorities, because that kind of fit their analysis of the scene and the fact that the one girl was displayed and so on, and that would fit his voyeuristic tendencies and so on. Then, after the grand jury failed to indict Jones and Mansfield, they still had the murder on their hands, and so is the words of Scott Smith. We got to look at that crazy preacher over in Nebraska. He was living in Sutton, Nebraska at the time, and he lit a couple of fires. He was a bit of a firebug. He was suspected of that, not caught, but he would appear, the fire would be 3 a.m, and he would appear in his usual 3-piece suit, dressed and at the fire before the fire engines got there. And they all knew he walked all over town and things like that. And he was suffering from paranoia. In Sutton, he would hide behind trees, and somebody come walking by, he would kind of hop out and grab them by the arm and said, I couldn't do it at Villisca. I was too short. And they didn't know what he was talking about, but they were unnerved by that. And so the grand jury then looked at all of the evidence and indicted him. And he was going to be arrested, but they didn't know where he was, but they found him. And he then was held until the trial in September. He was arrested in May and held until September. They finally got a confession from him, although it was obviously that it would not pass constitutional measures today, I don't believe. They decided, they had tried to get him to confess all summer, but he wouldn't. And so they decided to do one last attempt. And they brought down Risden, the fellow I talked about with the axe. He was there. Havner, the state attorney general, was there. The sheriff from, they were in Logan, Iowa, which is a far western Iowa. And the sheriff in that county, and I can't remember the county that is, he was there. And I think there was a fourth man, all of these big, burly cops. And they started early in the evening, 8 o'clock, something like that. I think it was 2 days, 3 days before the thing was scheduled to go to trial. And they berated him and kind of hovered around him and threatened him. And he, after a couple of hours of this, they took him back to his cell, where one of the authorities was reading the case against him, the testimony that they had gathered that accused him of this or that related to the murder. And then they took him back, and another hour or two of grilling by these guys, and then it was back to the cell. But now he had two inmates that had joined him. They were in overalls, and they were highwaymen. They had been arrested for trying to rob people on the road. And one of them was the editor of the Missouri Valley newspaper, and the other was a deputy sheriff from Pottawatomie County, that's Council Bluffs. And they were playing the good cop role by telling Kelly that he ought to confess, he'd go easier on him, and so on. Well, he was getting progressively more psychotic and unstable, and finally, towards morning, I don't know, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, something like that, he dictated a confession. And then, unfortunately, from the state's point of view, a couple, 3 hours later, 9 o'clock in the morning maybe, Oscar Winston, who is the county attorney of Montgomery County at that time, young county attorney, he and Kelly and Kelly's wife had gotten really quite almost friends. He was very protective of Laura Kelly and so on. And so he said, Lynn was sitting there, and he said, Oscar, I'd just like to tell you what happened. I want to get it off my mind. And so he then dictated a second confession, which unfortunately was not the same as the first. I mean, there were differences, and 2 is probably worse than none in that sense. But the confession had him taking a walk. He said that he was working on a sermon, Slay Utterly, and it's like a windmill in his head, this noise. He couldn't stop it, and so he thought he'd take a walk. And the family, he was living with the Presbyterian minister and wife and kids that night, sleeping there, had come to town to preach out in the country, and now on Monday morning was going back to Macedonia. He then, they went out and slept in a tent, so he was in the house alone. And he claimed that he decided he'd take a walk. And he was almost certainly looking for windows to peek in. And the manse is about 3 blocks straight up the street from the murder house. They're on the same street. And he said he was walking down the middle of the street, and he could see the lights in the northwest corner of this little house. And he could see 2 children getting ready for bed. And he said the Lord's voice came to him. He raised his hands to heaven and said, Yea, Lord, thy servant heareth. Suffer the little children to come unto me, the Lord had said. And he went there, and the Lord provided. There was the axe. And he said, I went in, and when I went up the stairs, I thought I was climbing Jacob's ladder. And I killed the parents, and then the Lord's voice came and said, more to be done, still more to be done. And I went in the south room, and I killed the 4 children. And I got down to the living room, and I was standing. I was tired. He said, I wanted to sleep. And then the Lord's voice said, still more to be done. And I went into that back room and killed them. And then I stayed in the house until the sun was just cracking the horizon, and I left. Now, the most damning evidence against him actually was that the morning of the murder, he was riding a train, went through Red Oak, that's going west, at a place called Hastings Junction. There's a branch line comes from the south, and it comes from Sidney, Iowa. And he got on the train, he left the main line, got on the branch line train, and as he came down the aisle, there were 2 parishioners, 2 people that were in his congregation in Macedonia. Their names were Simmons. And they said he put his hand on the back of the seat and said the most terrible thing in the history of the world happened in Villisca last night. Whole family was killed. And he talked about the murder. And that would have been he got back to Macedonia about 7:30 in the morning. He left at 5:19 in the morning, and the murder wasn't discovered until about 8:30. And so he was somehow talking about the murder beforehand. Now, he had a good lawyer. Wilkerson saw to that. And that lawyer raised the question. The Simmons were an old couple, certainly in their 70s, and he asked him, well, how do you know it was the 10th of June? Is that the date? And he said, well, I don't know. It was early in June. I know that. Okay. Could it have been the 3rd of June? Could it have been the 17th of June? Well, I don't know. I don't think so. But, so their testimony became rather indefinite. But the damning part of it was that the ticket evidence from the Sydney thing that showed that the only day in June that they sold 2 tickets from Sydney to let's see, they didn't live in Macedonia. They lived in that little town just up the road, but I can't remember it right now. Therefore, the only day that those 2 people could have been on the train was the day of the murder. It was discovered, and that's pretty damning evidence, I thought.
Yes, it is.
I think there's no doubt that if there had been a change of venue, Kelly would have been convicted. It is always possible. It's been raised by a lot of people that now Kelly didn't commit the murder. He saw the murder. That Kelly was peeking in that window when the killer came in and killed the girls. The first time I heard that was from a lawyer in Red Oak, a guy named Jonathan Winters, and no, not Jonathan Winters, Jonathan Richards, not the comedian, the lawyer. He told me, he said, well, a lot of people have talked about that. And I said, well, what do you think of that? And he said, no, I don't believe that, because he said the coincidence is too great. To have someone as sick as Kelly looking in the window when somebody as sick as the Villisca murderer was doing the actual murder is just too much of a coincidence for me. But that is bantered about a good deal as to whether or not Kelly didn't do the murder, but he saw it. He would have been convicted had it been a change of venue.
And there was one holdout juror, correct?
Yes, that's right. Okay. A man named Brown, who was a banker, and so that cost, he was a farmer and owned, he was on the board of directors of a bank in Red Oak, and that caused the Wilkerson crowd to believe that he was holding out because he was protecting his fellow banker from justice. But he refused to vote. He voted that Kelly was innocent by reason of insanity.
Right.
He actually had done the murder, but he was insane, and therefore that was a different category. So they had 11 for acquittal and 1 for acquittal by reason of insanity. And so they retried him, and then it was 12 to nothing for acquittal. I talked to a juror, interviewed one of the jurors, and he said, well, we didn't accept the confession at all. He said we didn't think that meant anything because Kelly had a obvious bruise on his cheek, and we thought that was evidence that he had been abused, and the confession had been beaten out of him. And it's possible he was roughed up a little bit, I suspect.
And there were differences between the two confessions. The first one, he said he murdered the children upstairs first and then the parents. Yes,
there were some differences. Nothing much, but it wasn't word for word. And they debated, the prosecutors debated about that, and finally decided they were obligated to go with the one that was first. They ignored the one that Winterstrand got, and I'm sure they wished he hadn't gotten it. I mean, I'm sure he would have said, "No, you confessed already. I don't want to hear or anything like that." They did prove that he was left-handed.
Right.
When he was in the jail in Logan, Oscar saw him many times, and he said that, well, Lynn, you've been in here for a month, 2 months, I don't know, quite a long time. Would you like some exercise? And yeah, he would like some exercise. That'd be good. He'd like that. And he said, well, we've got some wood out back, needs chopping. Would you be willing to chop some of the wood? And I'm sure that every one of the officials were standing at the back window watching, and he swung the axe left-handed. So right. Pretty obvious that he was left-handed.
You have been listening to Dr. Edgar Epperly, author of the book Fiend Incarnate, Villisca Ax Murders of 1912. Please join us next time on the podcast for the conclusion of his conversation about one of America's coldest case files. On behalf of Misfit Apparitions, I'm Don. Thank you for listening.